So we're doing something a little bit different today. This time we're talking about a different topic in the region, also a very contentious conflict and one of the top humanitarian priorities in the Middle East and North Africa region. We are talking about the political dynamics of Yemen and the causes and contributing factors to the current crisis in Yemen, and we are learning more about the crisis. This is a underreported issue, and so it is very good to have these incredible people who are bringing attention to this issue and are putting interest in this issue. And I would like to thank you for coming on, and I would like to thank them for joining us. One of them is Iman, and she is a master's student in peace and conflict studies at the University of Waterloo. And the other one is Daniel Albo, and he is a business student in Toronto. And so you'll learn a little bit more about these people as well. They have been participating in other community groups online that I'm part of, and also in Unity of Strength, Iman's been involved in, and Daniel is just coming to be involved in. So we'll leave it to the two of you to introduce yourselves and take it from there. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief. As Rebecca said, my name's Iman. I'm currently taking a master's in peace and conflict studies. My interests are primarily in Israel, Palestine, but I'm also interested in Yemen and Ethiopia. Part of it is personal, just learning more about my roots, but then also considering we live in a global world, I think it's important to be educated and aware of the global issues, whether they're near or far, because they have an impact regardless.
Hi, my name is Daniel. To add on to what Rebecca said, the business marketing student. I'm going into my last year. Other than my interest in, say, the world, marketing and business, I have a very strong interest in the Middle East specifically. Being someone who's born there, most of my family lives there. I have an interest actually with the whole region, though I can say maybe specifically Israel, Palestine is my interest. Though throughout my life, like I've known Yemenite people, even as a family friend. So I do have an interest in the Yemen crisis too, especially as you could say now, Yemen is probably like the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So only it's natural that I'd be interested in that too. So me and Iman are gonna start explaining. I think it's really good to today. Most of the conflict is based on around more present issues, but you do need to understand some aspects of Yemen and their old history to actually get into how this whole country grew and became about religiously and territorial, because that's arguably the two biggest disputes right now, along with just general local and clan tribal issues. So to start off, Yemen as it's been a very integral land for throughout history. One of the biggest things that you can see if you look at the map that I have behind me and behind Iman is that it's surrounded by water on all three sides. So what this means that throughout history is very important for trade. It connects to Africa, it connects to Arabia, to Asia, to Europe. So this has been a very important place. You could say the first civilization that really utilized this and actually emerged from Yemen is the Sabaeans. They were able to use trade and through the Red Sea, they were able to trade throughout Ethiopia as they were from the north of Ethiopia across the other side of the sea and whatnot. Just something to know about them. They were just made up of different clans and they started to practice Arab paganism. So this is the first religion we know is Arab paganism. Now, if you move on, you had the Himyar dynasty. This is the first dynasty that actually became Jewish. So now you have a second religion. This is around antiquity time, going into the more later, getting closer towards the Middle Ages, but still not as much. You had conversions, and you had very notable kings like Abu Karib, who's actually the first person to put a kiswar on, which is basically the cloth you have over the Kaaba. So this is someone from Yemen who was very important throughout Islamic history and just history in general. You had invasions from Ethiopia, which were Christian. So now you have not even just converts in Yemen, but you also have Christians too. And then in the 7th century, you have Islam coming. So when the Muslims came, over 50%, this is what the records say, over 50% converted to Islam. And most of those people who did convert to Islam were already to begin with Jewish converts. So now they're just moving on to another religion. At first, it was the Rashidun Caliphate, so everyone will be converting it to Sunni Islam. This is also Sunni Islam is also the most popular Islam around the world. So this is just also continuing into Southern Arabia, Yemen. What happened is the late 9th century. Basically, there were some Zaidi people. Zaidi is just Shia Islam, and it's just another branch very related to Ismailism. And when you have this type of conversion, so people are now shifting towards Shiaism, what you now have to see, this is starting to get to around the year 1000 AD, so 1000 years ago around, you have people who are not only Sunni, but you now also have people too who are becoming Shia and Sunni. So now you have two different caliphates who would be different sects, and they'll try to have influence over the land. And also you would have different people just in general who are two different sects. So that could also cause problems. Now, basically, to sum it up, the rest of the Islamic period, you just had different empires, different sultanates, all these things. It would basically just switch from Sunni to Shia until it went to the Ottoman era. One thing to know about the Sunni and Shia divide is if you look at the picture behind me, the green area is one of the most mountainy area. As you can see, Sana, it's like that green dot inside the green area. Sana is slightly more Shia at the moment and has been like that for a while. Just in general, the mountainous areas is you just had clans who were Shia, who were Ismaili, Zaidi. Zaidi is like the main type of intellectual school for Islam. That's Shia in that area. And the rest of the area, as you can see behind me, the pink is Sunni. They're just different Sunni clans. So this is how you start to have the divide. And this will continue on throughout the Ottoman era and the British era and on to independence. Now, when we look at the British and Ottoman eras, basically the South would be British, like you'd have the Protectorate of Aden. If you could see it, it's the little yellow area kind of on the border off of the coast, the south coast, as you can see. It's a very important port. That area has been under the British control and the rest is British. And then the green area, as you can see here, was always been Ottoman. And the Ottoman are more Sunni, so you have that type of influence. So this could get us towards the end of the Ottoman era. So eventually you had independence happening. The Ottoman era fell in 1918. So first of all, the whole green area became a kingdom, its own kingdom. You would have this is the formation of northern Yemen. This kingdom could formerly be called Northern Yemen. And now this Northern Yemen is an entity that you can even see today within the country. And then you had the South. The South also stayed as a federation. So you had the federation within the South, and you also had another political entity to represent the other segment of the South. So it's three political entities. And then, as we know, eventually the two parts of the South. After the British seized their control, they became one united South, Yemen. And then we had the North, which stayed as the North. Now, there was a draft. I know Iman was going to talk about this, but I was just going to add that in 1990, there was eventually a draft to achieve unity, though I'd like Imam to talk about what was so difficult from the 1960s to the 1990s in getting the North and the South to unite. And even actually today, also, there's a lot of issues about unity. So I'd like to shift it on to Iman, and she could talk about this part.
Thanks, Daniel. And also to just touch on something that was said before, Yemen's geographical location was very strategic for things like trade and just alliances in general. And so that very much explains why, at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there was Turkish occupation in the north and there was British colonization in the south. And as Daniel mentioned as well, a split between, the Shia, and Sunni sects. So fast forwarding a little bit, there was a nationalistic coup and the imamate, they were replaced by the Yemen Arab Republic, also known as YAR in 1962. But the tribes, the local tribes had resisted, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UK supported these tribes, while Egypt supported the republic until 1967. So this is all happening in North Yemen. We have the international powers involved. And this is sort of where civil war ensued. And this remained until Yemen reestablished diplomatic relations with both Saudi Arabia and the United States, and yet still maintained its weapons trade with the Soviet Union. So civil unrest was just an ongoing cycle in the north, whereas in the south, there was a British occupation of Aden until 1839 and the surrounding hinterland. And it was that city in particular was the exclusive focus of the British for 123 years, until they were radical nationalists who were partially inspired by what transpired in the north, and they sought independence in 1962, and that independence was fully realized in 1967. So after the British withdrew, you have the National Liberation Front assuming power, and South Yemen becomes known as the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. And so in terms of the Civil War and the divide, between the North and the South, with the North being politically and economically stronger, it was definitely more conservative in the North, while in the South it was much more left-leaning, which is attributed to the significant religious differences between the two, which Daniel touched on. And this divide, continued to perpetuate conflict on the ground. And this is where the unification of the North and the South, comes into play with the creation of the Republic of Yemen in 1990. And this brings together over 16 million inhabitants, which is over half of the total Arabian Peninsula population. And while it was initially a peaceful initiative between both governments, civil war did break out in 1994. And this civil war actually started when President Salih, who's a northern citizen, he tried to remove the vice president, which is al-Badi, who hailed from the south. So President Salih was the president of a unified Yemen in 1990 after the reunification of North and South Yemen, but he did try to overtake someone else in that process. And so his General People's Congress, the GPC, they won a majority in the 1993 parliamentary election. And the GPC is primarily composed of military and tribal groups, while al-Badi's Socialist Party came in second, but they won the popular vote in the South. And the people in the South, they were very dissatisfied and they felt very disenfranchised on account of their mistreatment by, the Salih's government. And then they tried to secede, they tried to separate. And this is when civil war, followed in 1994. The North won, and then the political climate has continued to escalate into further deterioration until the present day. And this is where we see things come to a peak. This is approximately 20 years later when the Houthis who sought to expand their control beyond the north and central parts of the country. They overtook the capital, Sana'a, in September 2014. And they had the support of former Yemeni President Salih, who had been president of Yemen since 1979. The Houthis wound up killing him in December 2017 after he withdrew his support. And in response to that, the United States, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the UAE formed an alliance to put a stop to the Houthis and loosen their grip on Yemen by supporting governments and rebel groups like the GPC and the Southern Transition Council, which is pro-independence. So I suppose we can now go into the key players, unless you have anything that you'd like to add, Daniel, about the
nothing really. I would just like to add maybe the reason why a lot of people in the South weren't happy is because they did vote mostly for the socialist parties, when just in general, regardless of the geopolitical issue or regardless wherever it is in the world, usually people who are suffering economically will always tend to vote for the more socialist, while the ones in the north did have less economic disparity, so they would be more pro Saudi government or whatnot, but it's just not as much the socialist. So you have this brewing as one type of divide, and then obviously have the religious and clan divide. And yeah, I think the key players is what we should talk about now.
Okay, so there are a lot of key players involved in Yemen, both domestic and international. I'll try and focus more on the ones in the region, particularly the Houthis, since they seem to get the most attention. So the Houthis, as Daniel said, they're part of a sect of Zaidi Shias who essentially cut themselves off from the main Shia sect, and they formed a movement that has some parallels to the Taliban, but they are against the Saudi coalition. That is their main reason for existence. So the founder of the Houthis, Hussein al-Houthi, he was the son of a prominent imam of the Shia Zaidi of Yemen, and he was said to have been influenced by the Iranian Revolution. And so when President Salih made an agreement with the Saudis on regional demarcation, the Houthis became fed up with the Saudi Arabia's interventionism in their politics, and they started to rebel. And so amid this sect, this was initially a moderate, nonviolent theological movement that was founded by Hussein al-Houthi in the 1990s. They were also known as the Believing Youth. And over time, this group became more radical and violent, particularly after their founder was killed by government forces in 2004. And now they're widely known today as the Houthis. So in early 2014, there was a new constitution that was proposed, but the Houthis were concerned that they were being marginalized. And as a result, they took extreme actions, which include their 2015 takeover of the Yemeni capital. And that's when they formed their own government. And the situation deteriorated further when they killed their former supporter, President Salih, in December 2017. And so in response to this, you have some other key players, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who start to support rival rebel groups, the most well-known of them being the Southern Transition Council, or the STC. This is an attempt to overthrow the Houthis from the inside. Their efforts have not been successful so far. Most of the UAE-backed forces have disappeared or been taken hostage by the Houthis, and there's also been some controversy over this approach, since the Saudi and UAE-backed rebel groups such as STC and even Al-Qaeda have often resorted to human rights abuses in the name of their mission, their goal to take down the Houthis, and civilians are essentially getting caught in the crossfire. And according to Crisis Group's, Crisis Group's 2020 report, Rethinking Peace in Yemen, the Houthis are, the new power. They're the new power balance. They are the main beneficiaries in Yemen, and have overtaken much territory in the northwest, especially since killing the former president. Whereas the STC seized control of Aden in August 2019, after there were tensions between them and former Vice President Hadi. And then finally, the government aligned forces and their tribal and local allies. They are loyal to Saudi Arabia, and they control governance to the east of Sana'a, the capital, as well as several governments in the south. And these government affiliated forces, they control much of the center of the third largest city in Yemen, which is Taiz, as well as some territory in the northwest. So I would say that the last main component, in understanding what these key players have done is recognizing that they have also cut off Yemen's connection to the outside world, the international sphere. The Saudi-led coalition has restricted international imports to the country. They've shut down the Sana'a International Airport to UN flights. This has been going on since August 2016, whereas the Houthis have severely restricted movement within the country, particularly into Taiz. And so while there are many conflict analysts who view this conflict as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, there are also a lot of opinions about the domestic politics at play, which have preceded any of the international or regional powers that have their own agendas and are focused on Yemen. Daniel, anything to add?
Yeah, I just like to say that I think the best way to look at it is that Yemen always had some type of differences in clans from the south to the north and east to west. Not as much east to west, but more north to south. And they did have empires in the past that did create unity, but you can just say since at least the end of just the empires, the Islamic empires, and more into the Ottomans and British, you start having the divide. The divide wasn't able to really be united very well, hence why they went into a civil war in 1994, the North and the South. So what you can see is that the British and Ottomans were there at the real start of the divide. And then these are just two foreign, you could say foreign key players. And then you could see just basically whoever gets involved. It could even be the North had their own civil war in the 1960s. So you had the Saudis backing the royalists, and you have the Republicans. These guys are both in the North, and the Republicans. So they will be supported by the Arab Republic of Syria, the Arab Republic of Egypt. All the other Arab republics will basically support them, and this is within northern Yemen itself. You can always look back at it that you have a lot of divide within the country, but it is important to see that whenever there is divide, there is always many sides coming from the outside, foreign intervention coming in. It never makes it any better, regardless of if whoever can say that, well, the support I get, like whether it be getting support from Gamal Nasser in 1960 in northern Yemen, or whether the Houthis gang support, or if it's the STC gang support from UAE, regardless, what you see is that it does more fuel than anything. And that's why we have so many players, even till today. You have territories constantly going in one political entity's control and then back into another political entity's control. So when we look at unity, right, this whole channel is about unity. It is important to recognize that a lot, if not most, of the political influence from outside Yemen is not really positive, but it has a lot to play, and it is more of just, you could say, instigation, or if anything. And how can we look today at Yemen? Well, I think if we understand the actual reasoning behind, say, why the Houthi does what they do, how the STC does what they do, how the Hadi government does what they do. To be fair, they all have human rights violations, all three sides. You could argue there's even a fourth side, but that's not really relevant right now. Every side, regardless of who you could say is right, who is in the wrong, they started it, the pointing the fingers and whatnot. What it is to remember is that more than anything, you have to just understand what these different people have in their desire. If it is independence, you can't just look at it as if it's seen as something that's not causing peace. So it's not something to really seen as aspiration. People's aspirations are the most important. I don't think any of the conflict is going to be solved without sides understanding aspiration. And if the aspiration is, say, the South having independence, or a part of the North having independence, not Sana can't be really independent like that, but any type of independence, it should be listened to. Yeah, and I think Iman could continue from there.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it, but I will just add a few more points. As Daniel said, I think that understanding the motivations behind these key players is essential to coming to some kind of resolution, whatever that might be. It can be quite overwhelming to look at something at this scale. But for example, I think the understanding that the Houthis, they're not just fighting, for the sake of fighting. Much of their motivation for fighting is to protect themselves from, or protect their country from, what they see as foreign intervention, which would be Saudi Arabia in their eyes. They look at Saudi Arabia as trying to control Yemen via these legitimate routes, alliances, and supporting other armed militias, things like Al Qaeda, even ISIS. Whereas if you look at what the government supporters, their perspective, they look at the rebels, not just the Houthis, but all the rebel groups who are causing disaster in the region. But yes, particularly the Houthis, who launched a coup in 2015 and against the president at that time. And this was also in the middle of Yemen transitioning to democracy. So there's obviously a lot of unrest there. The government and these anti-Houthi factions, they look at the Houthis and they see them as essentially an extension or proxy of Iran. They don't see them as their own independent group with legitimate grievances.
Iran did deny it, though. Iran denies it, but there's a lot of claims. There's also claims they get from North Korea too, somehow.
Mm-hmm.
The Iran sounds a little bit more realistic, though. You can't,
yes,
until there's enough evidence, can't really accuse them that much, but it does seem pretty promising considering they're both Shia, very close to Mecca and Medina. So they do have importance and a reason to be there, as well as they already have some type of a spread of Shia Islam, whether it be in Lebanon or Iraq or Syria. It isn't the same because they are Zaidi. That's one thing to really remember about the Houthi. They are Zaidi. It's a little bit different than just what the Persians in Iran, or just all Iranians, what they practice as Shia Islam. So yeah, it is a little bit different, but you could just see them as like, oh well, Iran really does fund any Shia militant group, and the Zaidi Shia in the north, the Houthis, yeah, they do. It seems like they received some backing, considered they're even able to remove the government in 2015. And I'm pretty, till today, they still have, as well, it's been 6 years, they still have control over Sana'a. And if that's the case, then, maybe one could look at them as if they do have some type of militant backing, financial backing, economic backing, whatever it may be, from Iran. And that's definitely how the Hadi government sees it, also how the STC, how they see it too.
Mm-hmm. As well as Saudi Arabia. Yes,
Saudi
it's less of
Arabia,
a,
all the
yeah,
groups, UAE,
exactly. It's less of a
yeah.
question of, is Iran involved, and more question of, how much.
How
it
much
seems more
they
than anything
even,
else.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
yes, regardless, the Houthis still seem to have their own agenda, which has been pretty consistent even before their takeover of the capital. But then I suppose there are a couple more groups here to look at. So there is the STC, the anti-Houthi remaining blocs. This is non-governmental groups. You have the STC. There are also the military authorities in the coastal region of Hadramaut, as well as the Joint Resistance Forces. And there's also some Salafi militia groups who they don't have shared goals long term, but they do all have ties to the UAE. And they don't all necessarily support the STC as well, but one thing that they do share is the question, what is known as the Southern question, which is namely the South desiring and seeking independence, as well as in opposition to former Vice President Hadi. So this is also another component or group that opposes the Houthis, although for very different reasons than government supporters. And then finally, you have Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi Arabia views the political situation in Yemen, as well as its intervention, its ongoing intervention in the country. They view this as a matter of domestic security, and that was their justification for intervening in 2015. And as Daniel said, it's on account of the fear of Iran's influence and a potential alliance with the Houthis. And similarly, the UAE also got involved, mainly in support of Saudi Arabia, but they've also had a lot of tensions with the Hadi government. And in contrast, the Hadi government has clashed with the UAE, and they essentially view them as it's an outside power supporting non-state armed actors for their own purposes and their own agendas. So understanding the motivations of the key players and recognizing that in the midst of all of this, there are a number of civilians who are getting caught in the middle. It's a sobering reality, but it also, for any solution that comes about, it's really important to understand the history as well as the motivations and what can be done on the ground. So yeah, is there anything that you'd like to add, Daniel? That's pretty much it for me.
Yeah, I would just like to add that before we can maybe just get into the last part, which is more just the actual humanitarian crisis and how we can solve that. One thing we can look at is how isolated the country has been. There's many ways to look at it. It's also one way where we can't look at it is that they have this, it seems that Yemen, like regardless of if it's SDC in the south part, that has the influence from UAE. It could seem, say for example, the SDC, say for example, the South. The SDC, for the most part, in their pretext, it does state that they want some form of independence, though they will also coordinate, whether it be with the Houthis or the Hadi government at times, just for their own strategic purposes. And it seems that also the UAE too, they don't necessarily care whether the South actually has independence or not. It could also just be seen as someone who wants to have their influence. Same thing with the Saudis, forever supporting the royalists since the 60s in Yemen, northern Yemen specifically. And then even today, they're more on the same alliance with Hadi. Some claims is that they utterly are working together almost. It's almost parallel between the Hadi Saudi attacks that Saudi will do. Airstrikes will be seen as attacks by Hadi. So it's like, oh, now you have this person, Hadi, who's being influenced by Saudi. Some people will not even recognize the attacks, the airstrikes or whatnot actually being done by Hadi, but he's more just being manipulated by Saudi. You could say the same thing with the SDC and UAE. Houthis might be a little bit more regional, not as influenced from Iran necessarily. So they are acting more in their self-interest. To be honest, I do sometimes wonder if Yemen at the moment is mentally in the right mindset to actually be united, north, south, south of both the west side and the east side. Whether or not they have that, I think now the most important part is before anything, before you actually get to negotiations, before everyone's interest, because a lot of this whole conflict is about conflicting interests, and that leads to war. And then when war, you have humanitarian issues. We actually have to work backwards, start off with humanitarian crisis first. The malnourishment, for example, like insane stats of starvation. I don't know, I remember if it was 45%. are experiencing some type of starvation or famine. There's just a lot of different things.
There's about 2/3 of the population that relies on some kind of
Two-thirds of
international
some
aid.
type of like aid, this any type of aid, which means they're reliant. And I think just a little bit underneath the two-thirds are dire, not even just need a little bit of aid, but a lot of aid. And even just the age, like the average age is extremely low. Women are having kids, what is it, like 17, 18, they're almost averaging numbers now, which just proves how young people are having kids. It's just a constant need to have more and more kids. So families are struggling, which shows that Yemen is indeed isolated. Um, I think this more than anything, and it really does put a lot of questions into, say, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, whoever they may be. Iran maybe necessarily isn't as economically strong right now with the economic sanctions, but definitely does lay questions to more Saudi Arabia and UAE. Why are they? Does it seem like they're putting in more, say, strategic economic benefits into Yemen, more so for the purpose of supporting them against the Houthis than, say, to provide relief? And you could also add this question to a lot of different countries, potentially even the United States too. And this does really lead the world to recognize and acknowledge that this is a really bad situation right now. It is recognized actually as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And yeah, and that definitely, at least humanitarian wise, at least when it comes to starvation and famine, that is the number one thing that needs to be solved more than anything, more than unity, more than say independence or whatnot. Iman, if you want to touch up on that.
Yeah, I think I just have a couple of things to add, and then that's pretty much all I'll have to say. As Daniel mentioned, addressing the needs of malnourishment, I think are really important, as well as the economic needs. I would also say that de-escalation is
And
also
de-escalation, yeah.
extremely important before any kind of negotiations can surface, and very much as localized as those negotiations can be, the better. I know that there are a couple of groups that are already doing work in Yemen. One is the Berghoff Foundation, if anybody's interested in their work. And then there's another group called the PDSP that also they engage in negotiations on a localized level in various parts of the Arab world, and specifically in Yemen as well. And then I don't know if I have anything else to add beyond, again, just reiterating that final point.
Yeah.
Yemen is already the Arab world's poorest country, and it's now, part of the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And at the end of the day, it's really Yemeni people
who are suffering the most.
They're suffering the most, and they're, in my opinion, this is my opinion here, the best equipped to understand the situation on the ground and actually to do something about it. There are civil society organizations on the ground that are, trying to bring about peace, trying to bring about unity. And I think that the best thing that we can do as people on the outside is, one, to educate ourselves, and also look at the role that our governments are playing in perpetuating this crisis. So I know that for Daniel and I, being in Canada, our country has been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. So as citizens, that's something that we can do. We can criticize our own governments. We could say this needs to end because this is affecting the lives of thousands upon thousands of people. And so that's my input. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. Before I just give it to Rebecca, I'd just like to conclude that I know stuff like that is very much anti de-escalation. So we do need to work, whether it be just to even spread awareness about what's actually happening, because I'd argue that there are a lot of other conflicts that are getting a lot more spotlight than, say, the Yemen crisis, other than
a lot more profitable conflicts than Yemen.
Yeah, just people other than people literally just saying that, oh, there's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. No, like, what is it? How can we do something to at least help the famine or all these different issues or the diseases, and then we could hop in further. into the actual unity versus independence versus all these different clan issues. And when we look at that, what it really should tell us is that even just understanding and acknowledging what's actually happening in Yemen, and just to really realize how bad it is, and just to push for any type of whether it be a protest at the Canadian embassy or whatnot, or whether it be just doing some type of donation or getting involved in any type of way, or even educating other people, that really does something. I think with that, that can lead us towards de-escalation to lead us to providing relief to the people. And then from relief, we go to aspirations and a final solution. Hopefully that solution will be the final nail on this, you could say, over 100-year-old conflict between the different groups within Yemen. And with that, I'd like to conclude and give it off to Rebecca.
Okay, thank you. So I've actually got a couple of questions for you. First of all, why would you make the case that Yemen is a higher world humanitarian priority than some pretty serious things? I'm going to say Syria. What is the case that Yemen is the higher priority than Syria?
It's not necessarily just a higher priority as in the people in Yemen, like their lives matter more. It's more about the aspect that just statistically, there are more people starving from some type of starvation, some type of malnourishment. Say the birth rate, it's strikingly, it's almost scary how high it is, and how young people are having kids at such a high rate. It's a bunch of different things. The infrastructure, despite a lot of Syria being bombed from different airstrikes or shelling, whether it be from Daesh or whatnot, they just do have more infrastructure than Yemen. Yemen is still, you could argue that Assad has a very strong control over a lot of Syria, while one part, they have Sana'a, which is under the Houthi. You have the south, which is divided in itself. You have the Hadi government, which has most of the country that isn't the north, but it's not always that strong, give or take where they're placed. So just in general, like politically, it's not stable, and statistically, they will just beat Syria whenever it comes to any type of crisis, any type of stat that's very negative and needs assistance and relief. But yeah, I know Syria's definitely up there. It's one of, I don't know if it's number two. I can't. Yeah.
Of course, and also to just say that it's not about a hierarchy, as Daniel said. It's not about certain lives mattering more than others. But in the case of Yemen, I mentioned this in the presentation that Yemen was transitioning into a democracy when the Houthis overtook the capital in 2015. And as of right now, unless something has changed recently, it's more or less an anarchist society. There are no, there's no infrastructure. There's no governing rules. Young children are driving vehicles on roads that we wouldn't even consider roads here in this part of the world. And so that, combined with the statistics of the malnourishment and the ongoing tensions as well, which keep flaring up repeatedly, I think, well, I wouldn't say, again, makes it more important than a conflict, than a situation like Syria. I would definitely say top priority.
Yeah, it's just that statistically it's the worst. Even another stat, I'll just add this one last stat, but I don't think Yemen, not Yemen. I don't think Syria beats Yemen when it comes to how long the public school teachers, professors have, and just in general, all types of teachers, how long they've been waiting to get paid. The teachers in Yemen have been waiting 2 years to get paid. I don't know if Syria is that bad. I think Palestinian territories, Palestine, it's been like 6 months and they haven't gotten paid. But I don't, Yemen is it's at 2 years right now. I don't think anyone is beating them. It's that bad. It really is that bad. And yeah, in terms of that, it really does merit the right to be called the worst humanitarian crisis at the very moment.
We can include some sources.
Yeah, we'll put it in the bio to make it,
yeah, if people want to.
Yeah, I can't remember all the stats, yeah, but for the most part.
So another question from the audience is, what is happening to the Black Yemenis, and are they oppressed especially?
Iman, would you like to go first or should I?
I don't really have much to say, so I'll just say this. It seems to be, from what I understand, it seems to be more of a north-south divide. So you're going to have the Black Yemenis, typically more in the southern part of the region, which, as we've said, is typically more left-leaning. So in terms of a case being made about, I
Yeah.
assume this question is about racism. Is that what it is?
Yeah,
I'm
like
assuming
some
it's
type of
about
oppression.
racism, although it's
It's
not.
about racism. I don't want to say that race doesn't play a role in Yemen. It's hard to say, you know, as somebody who's not living in the region, but I suspect that it has a lot more to do with the religious divides, as well as, you know, the questions surrounding the economy, and I think to a degree just the political entities as well. I know that's a bit vague. I can't really address the racism question as much, but I do know that yes, on some level there is generally more of a preference for lighter skin in that region as well. That seems to be the
Yeah.
case across the board. That Yemen's no exception.
Yeah.
But the one thing I will add is that maybe a way to look at the dynamics. Obviously, we know that most of the Black Yemen people have Yemen nationality. The ones who are Black, demographically is about 3-4%. The other small minorities, Indians, the rest are just Arabs, indigenous to the southern Yemen, just different types of clans. So when it comes to the 3-4% that is from East Africa, whether they be Afar or other type of groups, Somali, they are mostly Sunni, so that is a difference. So when you have a lot of the Shia in the north, they obviously do tend to be a bit lighter just because they are from closer to the Hijaz, while the ones from the south are more admixtures, more influence from East Africa, especially from Aksum. Like if you think about like I said very early in the video, Aksum was from Ethiopia initially, and so they would have influence there. It'll be mostly in the south, and I guess why they would vote left, why they would usually just see this all over the world, but the socialism, oppression based off of any type of colorism or race or whatnot, usually does push people to vote left, and it might also want to push people, say Black Yemenite, to want some type of independence, because if the North don't have any type of Black, it isn't hard to see that there would be some type of oppression to the darker Yemenite people in the South, and that might be one aspect, probably not the main aspect. More likely the main aspect of wanting independence is, say, economic disparity, but the other aspect could also be race too. Racial divisions between maybe the North and the South, not as much. Like they are only 4%. It's not that much of a population, but it doesn't matter. It is definitely one thing. But as Iman said, you know, just to conclude, the bigger issue people usually highlight, and I guess it is true in a lot of ways, is that the biggest divide is between the religious, the Sunni and the Shia, and the North and the South. Not as much just Arabs versus Black Yemenites.
There certainly is, you know, racism, anti-Black racism in the Arab world. Yemen's not an exception
Yeah,
to
the Arab
that.
world in general, you know, it's
But
also
typically, yeah, it's not like the States. It's not like race relations in the United
even in
States
the
or
Middle East,
the
even in
West.
Israel, whether it be Israel, Palestine, or whatnot, it's kind of like a reoccurring theme I think we're seeing here. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So one final question before we go. The final question is, if there are a lot of people in the West and in other developed countries here on this talk listening to this channel, and so if they could do one thing, support one group, do one action on behalf of the people of Yemen, what might you recommend?
I like to say, well, it depends on what really suits your. If you know a lot of people who say they don't really know anything about it, and there are people that would find interest in it, definitely educate. I think education is the first part. Yet, like I said before the first thing that's most important is relief, providing relief, and understanding, acknowledging what that issue is, And then finally, it will then be to, once you understand, educate other people. Because you don't want to just say, oh, look, like the Houthis are doing this, and that, or the Saudis are doing this, and that. So you should, without giving them necessarily an opinion, explain just the background of the whole conflict, how it's really affecting the people, the Yemenite people, how they're suffering. That's the most important thing. And then once you spread that, then you could get into the deep conflict. But once people actually know about that, people aren't just seeing videos, say, on YouTube. That can do a lot of help. And on top of that, if you want to help financially, if you have the funds, you can do that too. And anything further, if you have time on your hands, you can go protest, say at whatever embassy to stop arming the governments if you live in that country or whatnot. Those are just things you can do.
Yeah, I would say, in addition to education, because I think that's really important. I know I mentioned this before, but the Berghoff Foundation and the Political Development Forum, they established something called the National Dialogue Support Program. And this is in support of Yemenis engaging in national dialogue together. So in terms of support groups, I would highly recommend them because they seem to have a good, decent understanding of the situation on the ground. You don't want to be encouraging more international interventionism when there are conflicting agendas at play. And then, yes, as Daniel said, I would definitely recommend like writing to your MPs, going to protests. I've gone to a couple of protests myself. So, you don't have to, it doesn't even have to be your consulate or your embassy. It could just be City Hall. Like it could be, anywhere that
When a
you can
lot of
find a group of
people do
like-minded
the
people.
minimum, it's like when a lot of people do the minimum, it could really it will eventually accumulate, and it could be a really impactful thing what you're doing. So yeah.
So I want to say to both of you, thank you for giving this talk. It was a very interesting talk. It really raised awareness of this very high priority region for humanitarian issues that really needs more attention. And thank you for raising awareness as well of what people can actually do. So, and thank you as well to everyone who has been listening. I hope you have a good day and bye-bye.